In the early summer of 1945, the air of the American South held a lingering, inescapable heat and humidity, and between the barbed wire and wooden barracks there floated a kind of slowed, suspended quiet. The end of the war was already drawing near, but the rhythm of the prisoner of war camp remained as steady as ever. Roll call, formation, distribution, patrol. Every action was repeated according to regulations, like a huge clock made of tin and planks. In the ranks stood silent men of different languages, wearing cotton clothes of uneven colors. The soles of their shoes scraped lightly against the cracked ground. Among them was a corporal from the Japanese Army Transport Corps. Her name was Nishida Tomoe. She had been sent here from the far side of the Pacific after enduring the retreat and confusion of the island fronts, followed by weeks of guarded transit at sea, until one afternoon she found herself standing at the entrance of the camp. The wood of the registration table shone with a darkened sheen where sweat had soaked it. The staff registered her in accordance with the numerical system. Name, unit, age were spoken briefly from her mouth and written into a card that had been folded many times. She showed no signs of nervousness or resistance, but each time she lifted her head, her eyes fell on the used fountain pen on the table, the curling edges of the forms, and the circular scuff marks left where the surface had been wiped. Her training in transport made it difficult for her not to notice such details. She had been trained to identify supplies, determine batches, confirm sources. She was used to using touch and sight to form reliable judgments within seconds. This was how she found order in chaotic environments and how she had survived in the past. So when she was taken toward the barracks, she remained silent, but observed without a sound the direction of the gaps in the planks, the tightness of the door hinges, the pattern stamped into the grass by repeated footsteps. Her steps were light, not deliberately so, but because her old habits made her automatically avoid uneven patches of ground. In the Transport Corps, that was a necessary skill for protecting goods. The camp had been laid out in a strict and simple design. The main road ran straight, from the shadow of the guard post all the way to the drying area outside the kitchen. The wooden barracks stood in rows at equal distances, their eaves numbered with hanging plates whose white paint had been yellowed by the southern damp. She was assigned to one of them. Her bunk was the lower one. The boards were dry, but rough enough at the edges to prickle the skin, as if they had been hastily planed. Buckets of water and brooms stood in the corner. The cracks in the wooden handles had been deepened by sweat. She did not lie down right away. Instead, she placed her few belongings in the small cubby by her pillow, moving quietly and carefully. Her life had once depended on predictability, and now, inside an unfamiliar system, she had only the observation of small details to help her rebuild that predictability. She noticed that the nails in the ceiling were evenly spaced, which meant that at least during construction, standards had been followed. She noticed that the footsteps of the night patrol sounded at fixed intervals, which meant the guards' discipline was stable. She noticed that the smell coming from the direction of the mess hall carried cornmeal and a faint hint of fat, which meant the food supply did not differ much from what she had imagined. These judgments gave her a faint sense of security, but that security belonged only to her own deductions. At the other end of the system, her silence and meticulousness were not recognized so much as they were overlooked. A few days later, she was assigned to a labor unit. Her work site was the repair shed near the back center of the camp. The roof was corrugated metal. When the sunlight fell on it, the heat made the metal emit small expansion sounds. The ground outside had been trampled repeatedly and was a darker gray than other areas. She sat at a wooden table. Scattered on it were torn tent canvas, straps with fasteners needing replacement, and shoulder straps worn down to barely usable. Every item bore traces of use and a clear need for repair. She picked up the edge of a damaged pack strap and ran her fingertips along the tear. The fibers had frayed from long friction, a texture different from the coarse hemp she had seen on the battlefield. She stored these differences in her mind, as if quietly analyzing a new supply system. For her, understanding materials meant understanding possibilities, and only by understanding possibilities could she know where things were fragile and where they were safe. These judgments had nothing to do with hostility, yet they appeared in a form very close to analysis. From time to time, the American soldier in charge would walk through and glance at her. What he saw was a silent prisoner examining cloth. He did not know that this examination was training. not preparation. There was no exchange of words between them, only the roles that the system had assigned. Under the corrugated roof, the air seemed especially heavy. Later on, the supervising soldier would bring tool bags from the warehouse and distribute them to the prisoners responsible for repairs. That was the first time she saw the personal sewing kits used by the American forces. The fabric was a dark cotton sewn by machine, the binding along the edges almost without deviation, and the metal pieces fixing the fasteners shared a uniform brightness. When the sewing kit was placed on the table, there was no particular sound, only a soft landing. Yet in that small movement, everything needed for the coming misunderstanding had been quietly set in place. Difference began to widen at that moment. Her training prompted her to focus on every line of stitching, while the camp system regarded such attention with caution. At her station, she thought she was seeking order. At the other end, the system suspected possible scrutiny. Neither side was aware of the conflict behind this, and both simply moved forward in silence. Up to that point, no one had realized that this sewing kit would become the starting point of a misunderstanding. It was only one tool among many, but between two systems, it formed an almost invisible fissure. She then reached out toward it, her fingertips touching the cloth surface lightly. Her movements were steady, calm and natural, with no overt meaning visible from outside. When the sewing kit was placed in front of her, a hot wind was blowing in from the end of the dirt road outside the shed, carrying the smell of dry dust. The usual sounds of the camp, footsteps, low voices, metal clinking, were dulled by the weight of the air. She did not open the sewing kit immediately, but first pressed her palm over the fabric, letting the warmth of it pass through her fingertips into her hand. This was a motion she often used to identify the nature of materials. It took very little time, but could tell her whether the cloth had undergone special treatment and whether it came from a standardized production line. The fabric felt slightly coarse under her hand, with a texture so even it was almost mechanical. She turned the kit to look at the angle of the weave. The warp and weft were tilted by a very small degree, a common trait in mass-produced cloth. She was no stranger to this shift, but still, according to her old training, she arranged the weave directions into a simple mental sequence. She was not trying to record anything. She was simply following her habit of understanding an object's structure before using it. She pressed down the fastener lightly. The metal ring gave a short sound completely different from the hand-hammered tone common in Japanese quartermaster supplies. She turned the fastener toward the light and studied the impression along the metal edge. The depth of the mark told her it came from the same mold, and uniform molds meant a stable production line. She did not know that at that moment her actions had caught the eye of a guard standing not far away, nor that his training required him to pay attention to any unusual lingering of prisoners on American equipment. Those 2 seconds of lingering time, which were for her nothing more than judgment, were impossible for him to explain. She continued to inspect the needles, thread, scissors, and fasteners inside the kit. She was not selecting, but getting to know them. The thread on the spools was evenly wrapped, which showed that waxing times were consistent. The needles barely differed in length and thickness. The edges of the scissors bore patterned grinding marks. These details made her aware that the supplies behind the American forces were governed by a strict classification system, different from the Japanese quartermaster items she knew, and even less like the randomly sourced, chaotic supplies distributed at the front. These differences were the very things she had been most sensitive to in the Transport Corps and the ones she would most naturally notice. She picked up a scrap of paper placed at the corner of the table. It was the previous day's mess hall menu, the handwriting worn and thinned by repeated folding. She turned the paper over and quickly drew a few small rectangles on the blank side, each representing the arrangement order of components she had just seen. She marked them with brief numbers. This kind of notation was very familiar to her, often used in the Transport Corps to record manufacturing sequences. She drew quickly, without trying to hide it, and without thinking at all in terms of concealment. At the same time, a supply cart passed by the entrance of the shed. Its wheels rolled over the loose gravel, causing a slight rocking. The shadow under the corrugated roof trembled with the motion. Her head lifted by habit, her eyes briefly following the batch number hanging on the back of the cart for 2 seconds. She did not move her body, nor did she track it further. She simply stopped at that position because her training had taught her that supply batch numbers could indicate route and purpose. She did not intend to find out the route of that particular cart, only instinctively categorized which flow of supplies it might belong to. Unbeknownst to her, these movements formed a different pattern in the eyes of those watching. The new soldier on duty outside the shed felt a slight tightening between his brows when he saw her look up. His attention was activated, not by personal suspicion, but because his training told him to watch for repeated interest in supply routes. The first time she looked up, he did nothing. When she paused a second time, he began to observe more carefully, trying to decide whether this behavior was deliberate. She folded the paper and slipped it into a corner of the toolbox. Then she opened a section of the kit's stitching and lightly pushed the thread aside to observe how the light refracted between the fibers. With the pad of her finger, she pressed down along that stretch of stitching. This pressure allowed her to judge the tightness of the seam, a method the transport corps often use to distinguish counterfeits. At this moment, she was only confirming the durability of the kit. She lingered on the cloth a little longer, and her concentration made her forget her surroundings, which only made her action look even more like a deliberate evaluation of important information. The air inside the shed remained heavy. The corrugated roof had been warmed by the sun, and now radiated a faint heat. Light seeped in through small gaps, scattering onto the tabletop and illuminating the back of her hand. The soldier stood not far from the entrance, trying to recall a particular line in his duties. He had been told to watch for prisoners analyzing the structure of American equipment, and had been told that once there is suspicion, it must be recorded. He did not know at what level he should apply this rule, but the scene before him made him feel that he ought to do something. She gathered a small piece of the cloth's torn edge into her palm, a fragment left over from examining the weave. She had no intention of taking anything away. She simply wanted to compare it later with another piece of fabric to confirm the fiber thickness. She was used to keeping such scraps in the corner of her toolbox, discarding them only after verification. Everyone in materials inspection within the transport corps did the same. At that moment, no one knew this routine was part of old training, and only that soldier saw her tuck the scrap away. He did not understand what it meant, and could only classify the action, according to his training logic, as possibly collecting a sample. In the repair shed, the others had begun their sewing, and background noise rose around her, while her movements remained just as careful. She closed the sewing kit again, placed the thread ends back in order, and pressed the cloth scrap into the corner of the toolbox. Her gaze fell on the lines of stitching along the tool bag, as if confirming her judgments. Her fingertip moved very slightly, tracing a path hardly noticeable. From her perspective, this chain of movements was utterly calm. From the system's perspective, it lined up with exceptional clarity into another meaning. The record began to take shape in the breast pocket of the soldier at the entrance. He wrote a few lines in his notebook. The whisper of the pen on paper could not be heard from a distance, but the words were already there. He felt no fear or anger, only that his duty required it. He was not trying to guess her intentions. He was trying to avoid neglect. She did not see what he wrote, nor did she know what direction those few lines would take. She simply tidied the tabletop, gently moved the sewing kit to the side, and prepared to begin the actual repair work. When she drew the needle through the tear in the fabric, the first stitch made a small rasping sound as it passed through. It blended with the sound of the wind outside the shed. Her movements were composed and steady. Under her hands, time seemed to slow down on purpose, yet in the most natural way. The guard paused for a moment outside the shed, folded the record sheet, and tucked it into his breast pocket, then walked toward the main road of the camp. Dust curled into a small vortex around his ankles and scattered almost immediately. He did not look back and had no idea how that note would circulate. He only knew that he had completed part of his duty. When she looked up again, the shed entrance was empty. She continued sewing, unaware that a brief moment had laid the entire foundation for the misunderstanding to come. The sewing kit lay quietly on her right, its fabric still holding the warmth of the sun. To the eye, it looked no different from any other tool, and yet between training and institution, it had become a widening crack. Out of her sight, the small piece of paper had already left the shed. Folded neatly, it bounced lightly with each step in the soldier's pocket, the edge of the paper whispering against a seam in the cloth. As he walked down the main road, the sunlight fell straight from above, bleaching the dust. He signed the duty sheet, placed the note with the patrol log, and went on along his route, not thinking again of the prisoner in the repair shed. He did not know what his action meant, nor into what process it would be drawn. The paper was later collected and placed in a wooden box in the duty room. The box's surface was marked by scratches from being opened repeatedly. The metal of the latch was dull but still firm. The administrator filed the note with other records in the same stack of documents and handed it over to the supervising officer on duty that afternoon. The officer was reviewing the camp's labor rosters. He flipped through a few pages and paused for less than a second when he reached the note, then drew it out and placed it on a separate pile. In this sequence, the pause did not signify doubt, only a natural act of functional division. The handwriting on the page was clean, the strokes somewhat forceful. The content was brief, but a trained soldier had written it clearly and precisely. That precision made it inevitable that the paper's fate would continue forward. The officer slid it into a file folder and carried it deeper into the camp, to a small office. It was a place devoted to processing security information. The desk was broad, and the light came in from above at an angle, making the layers of documents on the surface stand out. Inside, 2 officers were sorting through messages from the morning. One of them took the folder and laid the note flat in the middle of the desk. He read without emotion, checking the contents as required. His fingers passed over the lines one by one, pressing slightly to keep the paper flat. He read words like repeated observation, recording, possible structural sketch, and contact with materials. These terms were familiar to him and were precisely those he had been officially instructed to watch for. The other officer took a thicker file from a cabinet, a prisoner's personal file card, its edges whitened by frequent handling. The 2 documents were placed together. They did not contradict each other, but under the logic of the system they automatically formed a connection. Her number, identity, original unit, and the type of labor to which she had been assigned were all clearly recorded on the card. That clarity made the judgment lighter and more inevitable. Her file card was open to the remarks section, a space usually blank. The emptiness now emphasized the handwriting that had just appeared on the note. The officer laid the record slip beside it and nudged her file upward by an inch, aligning them visually as a single set of information. He did not comment, only performed a very natural action. He stamped both pages with a small rubber stamp. The mark was deep blue and signified requires further confirmation. At that moment, her name was gently and silently moved from the mass of ordinary prisoners into another category. No one had deliberately pushed it, but the procedure moved on. Meanwhile, she was still in the repair shed, head bowed over a damaged strap. As the needle pierced the fabric, a faint rasping sound followed, and the tensioned thread vibrated lightly in the air. Her movements remained, as always, steady, careful, carrying the trace rhythm of her former work. She did not know that someone had recorded her actions, nor that the record had already passed through 2 sets of iron doors. All she felt was the tension of the fabric beneath her fingertips. That was all she understood. In the afternoon, the light slanted in through the entrance and washed the tabletop in a pale color. Bits of fabric floated in the air, as though about to settle but not yet fallen. She glanced briefly at a passing shadow outside. It was only her habit of checking whether her surroundings remained stable while she worked. She did see a soldier walk past, but had no reason to think more about it. She continued, her wrist moving at its usual pace, as if stitching together one segment after another of time that was repetitive and safe. Inside the camp, documents were moving faster than she realized. The deep blue stamp carried a quiet power. It was neither threat nor warning, merely part of the procedure, yet it determined the next step. 2 hours later, an officer took that file to the registration point. He exchanged a few brief words with the duty soldier, nothing extra. Then he had the clerk write a time and a number in a thin logbook and sent a military policeman to the repair shed. The process was as quiet as the movement of ordinary supplies, not the movement of a person. Outside the shed, the air was hotter than in the morning. As the military policeman approached, she was trimming the thread and folding the edges. She sensed someone near her and looked up. He stood at the table, called out her number, and told her to stand. His tone was even, his movements standard. She did not understand what was happening, but obeyed, setting down the cloth and lightly brushing the fibers from her fingertips as she walked toward the entrance. Her first step was no different from any other, except that the air outside suddenly seemed broader and brighter. The sunlight pressed down from above, stretching her shadow long and thin on the ground. She could feel her pulse moving gently beneath her skin, not quickening, merely tightening in a way that was hard to notice. The word fear did not form in her mind. She simply did not know where she was being taken, nor whether her silence would now be misunderstood. The military policeman told her to walk behind him, not too close and not too far. They crossed the main road, past the wooden racks where blankets were hung to dry, past the water barrels by the kitchen, and passed under the shadow of a patrol post. The sounds of the camp seemed clearer along this route. The clatter of pot lids, the rattling of chains, distant calls, all continuing in their usual rhythm, as if none of it had anything to do with her. At last they arrived at a low, white-walled building. The iron handle on the door was polished bright by many hands, evidence of frequent use. She was led inside and told to sit on a metal chair. Its legs were slightly higher than those of an ordinary wooden chair, so her feet could not fully reach the floor. When she tried to lower her weight, she found no fully stable point of contact and had to adjust her posture slightly. The air smelled of disinfectant, with the faint rustle of pages being turned. Her number was written on a new form. The person writing did not look up, only pushed the form to the other side of the desk. Then the note from the repair shed was placed in front of her. The lines on the paper lay quietly, like a language she had never seen. She could read the written words, but not the meaning behind them. From her perspective, those actions were simply the natural continuation of old training. Now, in a foreign system, they appeared linked as if forming a single intention. The overhead light fell on the paper, sharpening the edges of the ink strokes. Her silence here ceased to be a shield and became a barrier no one could see through. She looked at the words, but had no language with which to explain them, and no sense of how far explanation ought to go. Her training had never told her that in another system, silence would become an amplified signal. One officer opened another file and placed a scrap of cloth next to the paper. It was the piece she had kept in the corner of her toolbox, now singled out. It lay quietly on the page, innocent, yet bound to be interpreted. The officer touched his pen lightly near the fibers, his face unmoved, merely slotting the scrap into a predetermined category. No one in the room raised their voice. There were no threats, no accusations, only paper, pen points, air, and the weight of the system itself. She sat straight in the chair, hands resting on her knees, the backs of her hands pale in the light. She did not know what would happen, nor that her actions were sliding along a trajectory shaped not by malice but by rules. At the other end of the camp, the prisoners in the repair shed kept sewing. The heat sounds of the corrugated roof continued. On the wooden table where she had sat only minutes before, the sewing kit lay exactly where it had been, its fabric still warm from the sun, unaware that it had become the center of the misunderstanding. And her name was no longer in the regular labor registers. It had been written into another form, becoming an object the system wished to further confirm. The time she spent on the metal chair was not long, but the stillness of the air made each second feel heavier. Papers were turned on the desk several times, the edges brushing together softly, as if opening a seam for the next stage. The officers' movements were neither hurried nor slow. They kept to the steady rhythm formed by their training. They were not there to scrutinize her in particular. They were simply carrying out their responsibilities as a new matter entered the queue. Several documents were laid out in a line. Among them were her rough sketch and the fiber taken from the torn edge of the cloth. The strokes on the sketch were slightly broken where the paper was coarse, but the order of the lines was unexpectedly clear. There were no directional arrows, no functional labels, only the sequential relationship between a few components. It was the form of record-keeping she knew best, yet now, in this system, it overlapped on the surface with what was defined as structural analysis. The officer moved the sketch closer to the light. His gaze rested on the sequence of numbers. The pattern from 1 to 5 did not resemble the notation customs of intelligence personnel. He did not say so out loud, nor did he reach a conclusion. Instead, he searched the folder for another example, a sample to compare possible uses. That example came from a different prisoner's statement record and showed a classic reconnaissance style of drawing. Starting from the outer structure of a target, moving layer by layer inward, highlighting weaknesses and observation points. Her sketch was different, even entirely unrelated. He placed the two sheets side by side, his fingers moving between them. The motion was direct and clean, without bias. The longer the papers stayed there, the clearer the differences became. Her numbers looked like the sequence of a manufacturing process, not the projection of a purpose. He continued to examine the cloth scrap, lifting it toward the lamp and teasing the fibers apart with tweezers. The surface showed traces of wax, ordinary in American mass production of sewing kits. He could see where the fibers had been slightly flattened by a fingertip, not the mark of someone peeling off samples, but of someone testing strength. The other officer spread out her service record. It was the routine training of a transport unit, identifying supplies, confirming batches, judging sources. Her training had nothing to do with reconnaissance and everything to do with materials inspection. They did not need to say this. Placing the card next to the record slip made the meaning emerge by itself. Outside, the sound of the patrol changing shifts filtered in, each footstep contrasting with the quiet inside. She still sat upright, hearing none of the interpretation taking shape. She saw only pages turned now and then. She did not know what these actions meant, nor that they were gradually pulling her back from the edge of risk. Her fingers curled slightly and slowly relaxed again. It was her only visible movement. The comparison lasted a few minutes. Then the papers were closed with a soft motion. The sound was not loud, yet it carried the sense of something being shifted from one state to another. The officer placed the record slip back into the folder and put the scrap into a small envelope as an attachment to the closed case. He wrote a few new lines of notes and stamped the bottom of the page. The ink was a darker shade than before, not the blue of "requires further confirmation," but another color signifying no dangerous intent. She was called to the desk. The officer's tone was as even as ever. He told her that her actions had been misread and that this was why she had been brought for clarification. The misunderstanding, however, was now resolved. His explanation was brief. It did not touch on the process, nor did it identify who had made which judgment. She heard only the parts she needed. The rest settled back into the system. She nodded and drew a quiet breath, letting her gaze fall on the sketch lying near the edge of the desk. It had already been placed inside a file envelope and would lie there as part of the record. The officer indicated that she should return to her work detail. She rose and left, her steps as light as always. The door closed behind her, and with it the temperature and humidity of the air shifted. She stepped into the sunlight, which was brighter than inside. The roads of the camp were still dusty, and the patrols walked their fixed routes. Her shadow moved forward with her, neither intersecting with anyone else's nor followed by anyone's gaze. When she neared the repair shed again, the small sounds inside enveloped her once more. Cloth being tightened, thread passing through cloth, tools brushing against the table, all returned to their familiar places. She sat back at her spot. The sewing kit still lay on the table, exactly where it had been. She reached out and touched the cloth lightly. That contact made her aware that whatever had happened earlier was now outside her reach, and the kit had returned to its meaning as a tool. She reordered the contents, placed the fiber scrap in the corner, but this time she did not put it in her pocket. She left it on the side of the table, to deal with when the work was done. From the next day on, she no longer relied solely on old training to handle materials. In the repair shed, she watched the American technicians' movements, followed the rotation of thread spools with her eyes, learned to distinguish the sound of the sewing machine motor with her ears, and memorized with her fingertips the resistance of fabric at different angles. She no longer hid her observation inside her actions, but began to engage with a new craft. The technicians did not know what had changed for her. They only thought she learned faster than the others. She did not explain, and had no need to. Her movements were enough to express the direction she had taken. In the weeks that followed, the weather grew hotter. Outside the barracks, the boards took on a faint scent of wood baked by the sun. Cloth strips hanging on the wire dried faster. She gradually learned to tell the time by the environment itself, no longer relying on others' instructions or tense reactions to changes in the system. Her workload stabilized. Her hands moved more skillfully. Under her fingers, fabric folded into clean lines. Damaged fasteners were filed and refitted according to American methods. As the war situation shifted further, the Americans began reassessing the disposition of prisoners. She was classified as low risk. Her file carried a brief note stating that her technical skills suited civilian production. She did not realize how this remark would affect her future. She simply moved as the procedure dictated from one column to another, while the direction of the system quietly altered the course of her life. After the war, she was not repatriated. Instead, she was allowed to remain in the United States and work in a civilian factory. The plant stood beside a zone for processing surplus military goods. It was a brick building with low windows, inside of which machines ran all day. The air smelled of steam, oil, and fabric. The floor was covered year-round with dust and lint. Here she was first assigned near the assembly line, where she dismantled old military items, sorted and restitched them, then sent them to new warehouses. Her movements grew steadier and more precise. Each seam she stitched was neat and firm. She no longer had to explain why she paid such close attention to the direction of the weave, nor did she need to hide how she judged the nature of materials. No one saw it as suspicious. They saw it as her skill. She began staying after work for a few extra minutes to organize her tools and learned the structure of the sewing machines faster than others. Years later, she used her savings to rent a small space by the processing district and opened a repair shop. The wooden door of the shop bore a faint horizontal mark left when it had been moved. Outside the window, the smells of machine oil and fabric dust drifted by. Inside, a dim lamp shone on the tools she used every day. She placed the old GI sewing kit on a wooden shelf and turned it into her tool bag. The binding had worn slightly over the years, but the structure remained intact. She mended old clothes, work garments, and the occasional torn cloth bag someone brought in. Her hands were as careful as ever, her fingertips as sensitive, her eyes still able to distinguish tiny differences in stitching. But these movements would never again be mistaken for danger. They were now only about craft, about living, about the quiet days she passed in peacetime. In the camp, that misunderstanding had once pushed her into the deepest shadow of the system. Now, among folds of cloth and lines of thread, that shadow had become a kind of experience. She never spoke of it and never avoided it. She let it sink into her movements and let the needle and thread in her hands keep moving forward. The sewing kit still sat on the shelf, its edges bright in the light. It had once almost caused her to be misread as an enemy, and later, in another time, helped her find her place again. It belonged to the war, yet accompanied her into peace. It was the starting point of the misunderstanding, and also the starting point of the extension of her craft. Life unfolded quietly between pieces of cloth, and her world no longer needed to be known through misunderstanding. Every day she pushed open the shop door, the dust in the air stirred lightly, like a daily life that had been stitched back together.